Right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Savannah Sullivan, and I'm the Climate Policy Director at Green Umbrella. Today is a fun event called Regional Climate Impacts and Housing Resilience. And this is the fourth webinar in our Regional Climate Action Lunch and Learn series, hosted by our climate policy program here at Green Umbrella. And today we're fortunate to be joined by HOME, or Housing Opportunities Made Equal Cincinnati, and we'll be describing some climate issues and how they intersect with housing issues, including resilience, equity, and affordability. And we'll also be sharing some strategies and regional efforts related to these efforts to create an open and safe housing market. So just a brief review that the climate policy program here at Green Umbrella, we work to foster coordination across our regional institutions on sustainability and policy, and are working in earnest to elevate these needs to state, federal, and philanthropic opportunities in order to draw in some resources to do this work. We have four primary goals that you can see here, but today we will be focusing on goal number 2, centering equity in regional climate action. So we're currently working on centering equity through 2 sets of programming to tackle this goal. And one that we're going to emphasize today is our participation in the Urban Equity Climate Compact, which is a national program hosted by the Institute for Sustainable Communities, through which we're working with partners to launch a regional climate collaborative this summer. You'll hear more about that at the end of the presentation. But this will be a network that engages regional governments and organizations to design, launch, and implement critical climate actions in Cincinnati, in greater Cincinnati, I should say. But today we're talking about housing and climate equity. And so I wanted to just cover the fact that some climate-related disasters and hazards are intensifying, and therefore there's an increasing threat to financial and housing stability of our communities. Unfortunately, households of color, low-income renters, and under-resourced communities are disproportionately burdened by these hazards. This includes increasing frequency and severity of extreme heat, which we now understand from research predominantly has impacted Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. They're on average 5 degrees hotter in the summer compared to white neighborhoods in the same cities. High intensity storms, flooding, and other hazards reduce housing availability, particularly in low income neighborhoods due to affordable housing, often being located in climate vulnerable areas. And furthermore, communities that have been marginalized by race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status through systemic underinvestment have often significantly experienced heat islands, flooding, poor air quality, and this can lead to energy insecurity, so struggling to pay your utility bills, heat and indoor air quality related illnesses, and housing insecurity in order to make your payments every month. Blue lining is a term, it's a new one that you might have been reading in the news or social media, and it is unfortunately connected to redlining, which our presenters from HOME will be sharing a bit on in a second. But what blue lining characterizes is how banks and lenders are beginning to draw risk lines around certain neighborhoods based on their susceptibility to climate impacts. And this often coincides with previously redlined neighborhoods that targeted communities of color. The practice involves assessing neighborhoods for environmental risk, leading to increased insurance and lending costs and already limited investments for flood or other risk prevention, and furthering the cyclical decline of these neighborhoods. Another phrase you might hear is underwater writing. And this just sort of blends the terms of underwriting and underwater. And this characterizes the use of external climate and environmental data when making loans to homeowners and assessing home values. Because of this increased blue-lined risk, property values in these neighborhoods are often less than surrounding communities, and this makes it harder for homeowners to obtain insurance or other disaster aid. And research has shown that about 30% of homeowners in special flood hazard areas, for example, are covered by flood insurance, and that homeowners of color are less likely to have this insurance. And so as natural disasters continue to get worse and more frequent, families will be continually forced to deal with the damage and repair and rebuild that comes from these impacts. And this contributes to a phenomenon called climate gentrification. So those who are forced to move will often face displacement and a loss of their stability and community, as well as a drain on their financial resources. Families without the financial resources to move are disproportionately low and moderate income households of color. And so this little graphic here just highlights 3 different ways climate gentrification occurs. One, superior investment. That's where climate resilient properties are considered more desirable, so their prices increase and only high income households can afford them. The cost burden version of climate gentrification occurs where less resilient neighborhoods are inaccessible to low income folks, and they aren't able to afford the expenses associated with natural disasters. And a third form of climate gentrification occurs when a neighborhood has climate resilience infrastructure, but that's just making it significantly more expensive. So Greater Cincinnati will not only experience localized versions of these impacts, such as flooding, landslides, and extreme heat, but due to our relative resilience compared to other parts of the country, such as the West and with their fires and coastal communities experiencing sea level rise, we are also anticipating that Greater Cincinnati will be considered a climate haven, where others evacuate their extreme conditions and seek refuge here. Fortunately, there are things we can do to address climate impacts and other housing concerns in Greater Cincinnati, and specifically to protect marginalized and under-resourced communities. So on that note, I'm really pleased to introduce our guest speakers, Elizabeth Risch, the Executive Director of Home, as well as Laura Castillo, the Research and Advocacy Coordinator for Home. So I'll pass it off to Elizabeth and Laura.
Great, thanks, Savannah, and thanks to you all for joining us. My name is Elizabeth. I'm the new Executive Director of Home. I just started about a month ago. So I'm really happy to be part of this group and kind of talking about housing issues and kind of climate issues. It's all related to environmental justice and kind of who has access to healthy, safe, affordable, and stable housing. So I look forward to kind of engaging with you all. I welcome connections and introductions as I build my network and connections here in Cincinnati and continue the work of Home. So I'm going to get us started with a little bit of background about Home and where we're coming from, what we do, and then we'll kick it to Laura to walk through the rest of the presentation. So we'll talk about who is Home, we'll talk about redlining, that Savannah kind of mentioned. We'll talk about the housing crisis and how it specifically relates to climate issues. Black home ownership is a big priority of Home moving forward, and relatedly kind of the roadmap to how to increase Black home ownership, and specifically today, you know, tying in kind of these themes of climate policy, blue lining, underwater writing. Those are new terms for me. I'm excited to kind of learn more about those or kind of see those kind of getting some coverage and how we incorporate it into our work. So thanks for bringing those up to me. And then we'll kind of go through the recommendations. So let's kind of move forward a little bit about Home. We're Housing Opportunities Made Equal. So we've been around since 1959, and our mission is to eliminate unlawful discrimination in housing in the Greater Cincinnati area. So we're really advocating and enforcing housing regulations for all protected classes and promoting stable, integrated communities. And I think related, you know, a part of that stable, integrated neighborhood is, you know, having a healthy, climate safe neighborhood. That it all, you know, when we think about where we want to live, where anybody wants to live, it's kind of in that healthy, vibrant, environmental friendly, protected from climate. You know, it's very much related to kind of these themes. So the services that we do fair housing enforcement. So under the Fair Housing Act, you know, it's illegal to discriminate in housing and housing related transactions on the basis of 7 federally protected classes: race, color, religion, national origin, sex or gender, family status, if you have kids under 18 or pregnant or getting custody of children, and then disability. So we're enforcing the Fair Housing Act as well as local and state fair housing protections. We do that by providing counseling for people who've been discriminated against in housing. We also do testing. So we send out testers to inquire about housing opportunities to see if there's any evidence of discrimination. We're always looking for testers. If you're interested in learning more about this paid kind of part-time employment opportunity, please follow up with us. We also do tenant advocacy. So we provide a lot of information about landlord-tenant rights to kind of anyone that calls us. We do housing mediations where we're mediating between landlords and tenants. We work focused in a couple schools, really helping families and parents learn about tenant rights and providing housing stability assistance throughout the pandemic. Specifically, we've been providing rental and utility assistance to our families. Education and outreach, where we're providing trainings and information about what housing rights are, educating both consumers and housing providers about housing discrimination, how it's still happening, what to do about it, and who to call. And then research and advocacy, which is Laura's department, that's really been focused on any kind of research and advocacy around related fair housing. So a lot of this is conversations about affordable housing and how that disproportionately affects protected classes and people of color. We're involved in lots of advocacy and coalitions here in Cincinnati to promote our values of housing integration and housing that's free from discrimination. We also provide a lot of our services in Spanish. We have a number of Spanish-speaking individuals on staff, so we can provide free services for any of our services in Spanish. So a little bit about redlining. Hopefully this is not a new term, but originally in the 1930s, the federal government created this kind of these maps through the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So the federal government was really involved in setting up a lot of these structures and systems that have long-lasting impacts about housing segregation and who has access to loans and home loans in particular. And so originating from the 1930s, the federal government was involved in creating these maps that color-coded neighborhoods based on what was deemed risky for home loans and home insurance. And so, red was considered the most risky, where there weren't any loans being provided to those neighborhoods for housing loans, home purchase loans, or for home insurance. And those red neighborhoods were explicitly communities of color. And kind of yellow was a little bit more risky, kind of green was determined the most safe. And so this, this map of Cincinnati is from what those maps looked like, where the red kind of zones were outlined out, where there were no access to financing for housing loans. And, I think it's important to note that the federal government was involved with this, but then the private market followed suit. So banks, other kind of loan companies and lenders followed the guidance of the federal government. And so this was, originated in 1930 and continues to have an impact, continued to have an impact throughout kind of the, up until today. We see kind of the impacts of where those neighborhoods did not have access to home loans, and what neighborhoods are still feeling the effects of that disinvestment, not just from the federal government, but from private banks and lenders, that then kind of led to other tools of segregation that we call it, about urban renewal programs and racially restrictive covenants, kind of really outlining out where people live and where people of color could not live. Those were all kind of explicit practices and policies often that determined the way that our city is crafted today. Next slide. And so, Black families are still being discriminated against in the housing market today. Kind of the recent history of things like mortgage denials, discriminatory lending, racial steering, where realtors or real estate agents, often banks, will kind of make those determinations of you'd be more comfortable in this neighborhood, or here's a better product for you, or a worse product for you, kind of based on your race or ethnicity. Appraisal discrimination is a very hot topic now, related to kind of noting that there's a lot of bias happening in appraisals, that there's housing values that are determined just based on the color of the pictures in someone's house. We actually had a case referred where a homeowner got an appraisal that was very low. They then kind of whitewashed their house. They took out all the pictures of their family that was Black, had another appraiser come in, and the value raised significantly. There's a lot of instances of these stories happening across the country about how appraisal bias is happening, which really dictates, what lending is happening, kind of who has access to make those loans, who has access to homeownership opportunities. Predatory and unfair lending practices, we saw a lot of that in 2008, 2009 with the subprime lending crisis, and lenders intentionally targeting communities of color for really awful loans that they couldn't repay. I think we're seeing an increase in that, and more kind of sketchy loans and offers being targeted to people of color. And then single family zoning is something we talk a lot about, and Laura will talk more about, but that has had an impact on creating kind of our segregation maps and our segregation in our city, where single family zoning that have very large lot sizes, that restricts any sort of multifamily housing has really, kept out, intentionally or unintentionally, has kept out people of color from living in those neighborhoods.
And
So
now
I'm going to give it to Laura. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. We're so excited to be able to be here today and have a conversation where we get to actually bridge together a lot of fair housing and environmental justice issues. So thank you, Savannah, for having us here. Switching over to a little bit of discrimination that we've seen through the decades in land use, services, and enforcement. And Savannah did cover a bit of this, so I'll go through this slide quickly, but we see lead and contaminant exposures and toxins higher in communities of color. We see higher asthma rates, higher risk to climate and weather effects. We've seen through the decades as well, discriminatory transition policies and investments, and then cumulative impacts of neighborhood health burdens and stressors. Next slide, please. So switching over a little bit to just discussing the housing crisis that we're seeing here in Cincinnati, I think it's gotten a lot of attention from a lot of our local officials, and we've had a lot of conversations like the ones today where we can dive into what exactly the housing crisis is. So the 40,000 unit deficit, we have about, which came from the Housing Our Future report, we have about, we're lacking about 40,000 affordable units here in Hamilton County. That being said, there has been an increase in production since the Great Recession. So we've increased about 80%. We are nowhere near producing to the level that we need to be producing, but I do think it's important to recognize that we have been increasing production. Now, we've also seen an increase in median sales prices in single family homes since 2010 of about 45%. And I think that that's, anyone trying to buy a house right now is having a very difficult time. We're seeing more and more people, with cash offers or houses that are very quickly going in the market. So again, going back to us not being able to produce or not producing at the level that we need to be producing, but that increase in production that we have seen, and where that need is really, really needed, is in that 40,000 affordable unit deficit. So we have about nearly half of Hamilton County's 80 to 300,000 extremely low income households are considered severely cost burden. So what that means is that there's about 41,000 households here in Hamilton County that pay 50% of their income on housing. So a result of all of these and many other factors is the unprecedented housing crisis that we see today here in Hamilton County and throughout the country. Switching the conversation a little bit to focus on Black and Brown home ownership. Nationally, Black renters have had evictions filed against them by landlords nearly twice the rate of white renters. We've also need to make sure that the reason that we're here today is because Black households should be able to compete fairly in the housing market in Cincinnati. Black-owned homes are worth about 18% less than white-owned homes, and the typical Black household has less than 1/4 of the wealth than a typical white household in the US. And that number is actually down about 1/3 since before the Great Recession. Focusing a little bit now to some of the local trends that we're seeing with Black and Brown home ownership. White wealth is about 10 times that of Black wealth, and Latinx is about 8 times. Or white wealth is about 8 times that of Latinx wealth. The Black home ownership rate is 33.3%, while a dramatically significant 73.4% of white residents are homeowners. That 40% gap is really the reason as to why we really are pushing for the roadmap to increasing Black home ownership, which I'll dive into in just a minute. Now, nationally, Black home ownership rate actually went up about 0.5% between 2018 and 2019, but during those exact same during that exact same year, we actually saw that number shrink by 1.7% here in Cincinnati. Now, there is also a huge amount of potential here in the Cincinnati market. There's about 19,000 local Black millennials that are mortgage ready and 19,000 Latinx millennials that are mortgage ready. Mayor Purval actually a couple months ago increased the amount of down payment assistance that is available. And that number, the 19,000 and the 9,000, they are mortgage ready if they had access to a down payment assistance program, which is why those are the kinds of policies that we really want to advocate for. But it is really important to note the problem is getting worse, and it's getting worse here in Cincinnati. Now, these numbers are the ones that I just mentioned, but I think for some reason for me, it always helps to just see them on a graph so we can really see the gap. So on the left side, we have the home values by race, and that's where we see that 18% gap in wealth or in value. And then on the left side, you'll see the home ownership by race. So we'll see that 73.4% for white homeowners, and then that 33% for Black homeowners. So that's that 40% gap. And this is from a Zillow 2021 analysis. Now, shifting over to fair housing and environmental justice. So these are deeply intertwined, though they have long operated in different silos. And I think the exciting thing about conversations like the ones that we're having today is we're really bringing the two together. So for vulnerable American households, to live in subsidized housing often means to risk environmental health exposures that are damaging and inequitable. Now, the environmental justice is part of HUD's legal responsibilities. So HUD actually released back November of 2021 their climate action plan, which is really great. I encourage you all to take a look at it, but it details a comprehensive strategy to reduce the agency's energy and carbon footprint and put our nation's communities on a path to building more equitable, efficient, and sustainable infrastructure. And the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity has committed to take actions over the next several years on climate and environmental justice. So it's really great and nice to see that it has been on the forefront of a lot of national conversations. But I also think that, coinciding with that, looking at the efforts that we are doing here locally is just as important. So HOME has really taken a lot of time to combat the threat of gentrification here in our neighborhoods. And the roadmap is exactly that. It addresses the historical discrimination and calls for racial justice. So going into the roadmap to increasing Black homeownership. So as I just mentioned, the roadmap addresses historical discrimination and calls for racial justice via the 6 policy recommendations. Now, it has had multiple contributors and sources, including the Community Building Institute, HOME, Action Tank, the Fair Housing Assessment of 2019, the Housing Our Future of 2020, LISC, and Legal Aid Society of Southwest Ohio. The Fair Housing Assessment of 2019 and the Housing Our Future Report of 2020 were really big sources of research for the roadmap. So while the Housing Our Future report has about 100 recommendations, what the roadmap team did was zone in on those recommendations that really focused on increasing Black homeownership and equity in housing, and then expanded on those recommendations. So here they are. I know we don't have that much time today, but just to kind of share them with you. So our first recommendation is to expand lending to low-income home buyers. The second recommendation is to create a fund to support repairs by Black and low-income homeowners to include interior and exterior home repairs with abatements provided on these improvements. One thing I was really surprised with is that Cincinnati ranked 4th nationally for having the oldest housing stock in the country. So really old homes are really expensive to repair. Modifying zoning to be more inclusive by expanding provisions for multi-generational housing and higher densities in appropriate locations. The fourth is to provide property tax relief to low-income homeowners in neighborhoods where property values are raising at a rate above the countywide average. And then the fifth is to modify tax abatement incentives to more directly support Black homeowners and homeowners in neighborhoods experiencing weak housing market performance. And lastly, to create an independent, transparent monitoring process so we fully understand, where we currently are. And then we can also be held liable for the progress that we do or that we do not see. Now, this is the last slide I have for you today, and this is probably one of my favorite slides, again, from that Zillow 2021 analysis, but this is actually 5 scenarios for Black homeownership for the next decade. If we currently perform in the next decade where we are projected to perform at, we will see a mild slowdown. So what that means is that we'll have Black home values grow 5% faster, and then the Black homeownership will grow at 0.5% points per year. Now, if we remember back from 2018 to 2019, it shrunk by 1.7%. And that's just in 1 year. If we continue on the mild slowdown path, we will see equity in homeownership in the year 2183. That is why it is so important for us to really advocate and push for these policy recommendations to really start to close that gap, that 40% gap. Now, let's say that we actually are super aggressive with our, our work, and we really push for these recommendations, and we see some improvement in this next decade. That will mean that home values will grow 15% faster, and we'll see that Black homeownership grow at 1.5 points per year. If we see that level of improvement, that number will go down to the year 2066. So that seems like a much better number for me. And I think I'll switch it over to Savannah.
Great, thank you so much, Elizabeth and Laura. So we're just going to wrap up today by sharing out just a few additional strategies and then some next steps here locally. And feel free to stick around for the optional Q&A from 12:30 to 1, where the 3 of us will be here to answer any questions you have on what we've shared. I wanted to pull out just some additional items from the HUD Climate Action Plan that Laura mentioned, because it really is exciting how they've outlined the connections between climate resilience, greenhouse gas emissions, and environmental justice. Some of the things that they encourage, not only to be happening at the federal level, but also what we can do here locally is collect data and mapping risk actually connected to climate and housing, strengthening flood resilience standards, providing climate resilience and environmental justice training in our housing ecosystem here. Other policy strategies include green building requirements and incentives, and creating green job opportunities connected to these types of building opportunities, and encouraging equitable community planning and engagement. So much like the last webinar we presented on in April, which was all about equitable community engagement. And really importantly, some strategies connected to health and safety in the housing itself. So preventing residential lead poisoning, minimizing radon exposure. This is all in that climate action plan, and definitely encourage you to take a look. I also wanted to highlight a local government example because there's a lot of latitude for local governments to create programming to incentivize the types of opportunities that Laura categorized, as well as what is mentioned in the HUD Climate Action Plan. One program I really like is the B Branch Healthy Homes Resiliency Program out of Dubuque, Iowa. And what that does is it includes almost $8.5 million in the form of forgivable loans to improve housing units, including both owner-occupied homes, single unit rentals, and as well as small multifamily residential units. And so that type of flexible financing that in this case is explicitly dedicated to the home repair and resiliency improvement of all forms of housing is really crucial. So it's a great example to take a look at. And the last thing I wanted to just call out is a lot of the things Laura outlined and that the HUD Climate Action Plan outlines, we're about to get a ton of funding for. This is not just a once in a lifetime expenditure on behalf of the federal government. This is a once in many lifetimes expenditure, particularly as it connects to housing and other adjacent issues such as water and energy. And so I just wanted to show you just the sheer magnitude and the breakdown of what is coming down the pipeline from that law, as well as highlight some housing specific expenditures. We'll see $3.5 billion to assist low-income households to reduce their utility expenses. We're going to see $250 million in state energy grants to conduct energy audits on a wide variety of housing. We're also going to see $3.5 billion through the FEMA flood mitigation assistance program. So that's going to provide jurisdictions with direct financial support to anticipate and prevent the type of flood risk that we can definitely expect here in Cincinnati. And there are billions of more dollars, as it relates to housing and resilience. So we'll be including some resources so you can dig in on that. And for any local governments or community organizations on the line, this will be very similar to the last infusion of cash we saw from the federal government about a decade ago during the Obama administration, where it's important to have shovel-ready projects in mind. And so that's why we want to connect you with partners such as Home and the other communities working on this in the region, because we got to start brainstorming ideas, and there's opportunities to workshop these ideas with federal officers if we want to prepare to access some of the funds that will be coming, not only routed through state agencies, but through metropolitan planning organizations as well. So that is the OKI Regional Council of Governments in our instance. And I'm going to talk a bit about, some opportunities to have those conversations. So save the date. We're going to be continuing this Lunch and Learn series. Our next one is on June 1st. So you'll see that in the follow-up email to this event. We also have our Midwest Regional Sustainability Summit coming up on June 16th, where we will not only be featuring Kristen Baja from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network as our keynote, but we're going to have tons of programming dedicated to these issues, and particularly as it relates to climate and local government action. Our plenary panel will feature not only Mayor Piraval, but the newly elected mayors of Dayton and Lima, Ohio, talking about climate justice action. And last but not least, we are launching that Regional Climate Collaborative that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation on July 21st. So this will be the regional venue to have conversations about regional climate action. How can we make it happen? But we have to start with collaboratively defining the problem and collaboratively defining solutions that are equitable and work for the wide variety of communities we have in Greater Cincinnati. So I'll stop there and we can move into Q&A. I know we threw a lot at you, but feel free to also send us questions via email. We'll share our contact information as well.
And I will add one more thing that I forgot to mention about the roadmap. So the roadmap was actually released back in 2019. So it's been around for a while, but we have been working these last couple months on editing, updating, and making it look a lot prettier. So in the next couple weeks, the next month or so, we will be re-releasing the updated version of the roadmap, and we will be sure to share that all with you. Now, part of that process is also us increasing our level of engagement. We really, want to make sure that we're doing our part to get the roadmap and the different recommendations in the right hands. And a lot of that is for, everyday residents and everyday advocates. So if you can think of a group that you think might benefit from listening to our presentation on the roadmap, we have a lengthier presentation where we actually break down all 6 recommendations and a lot of the reasons as to why those specific recommendations and some of the issues behind them, we are happy to come out. We were able to do Roselawn Community Council last week. So, we're a big fan of getting out. So feel free to contact us at any point.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm going to ask a question that comes from Sophie. So she says, this might be out of scope for Home, but rent prices are increasing drastically and displacing people. This looks like it will get worse as those with more wealth flee climate disasters and move here. Is there anything that can be done to combat raising rent prices and or absentee landlords?
So we do not have rent control here in Cincinnati, but that is, one of the policies that we can advocate for. We have very little rights here in Cincinnati for tenants. So one thing that I know Councilmember Mika Owens has really taken on pushing forward is having, like a tenant bill of rights. affordable housing advocates recently put forward 4 policy recommendations to increase those rights, and rent control was one of those. So not necessarily at this time is there much that we can do, but there are things that we should know that we can advocate for, and that's one of those.
Yeah, just echoing Laura. I mean, it's also a state issue. Like the state landlord tenant law is terrible in favor of tenants. So there's, both local actions that we can do, like the Tenant Bill of Rights and kind of advocating for local policies, but it really is a state issue that we all need to be, working towards and working collaboratively to change state law to better protect tenants and provide more affordable housing. Because I think, Sylvia, you put it right that rent already is increasing crazy amounts. We hear calls every day about, $200 increases. And it's only going to get worse, kind of especially with the climate issues and people moving here as a climate haven, as Savannah mentioned.
Excellent. Thank you, Elizabeth and Laura. I'm going to move on to our next question. This comes from Maya. How are we building on the ground public awareness of housing resiliency needs and resources, either through canvassing for research / writing public awareness campaigns or more? She added that she is a freelance copywriter interested in the intersection of affordable housing and climate resiliency. And so talking with community members has noticed there's very little awareness of the available resources. I'll let you all answer first, and I'm happy to jump in.
I think, again, you're exactly right, but it starts with having conversations like the one that we're having today. This has been really great to merge these two issues together. So just continuing to do this. I know Green Umbrella has been doing some amazing work. I believe, was it yesterday that they had a town hall or a meeting to discuss a lot of the issues, climate related issues that we're seeing here in Cincinnati. So I think exactly, pushing forward the work that's being done by organizations like Green Umbrella is a really great step.
Yeah, and I think, your point is right on here too about how are we building awareness about the needs. There's a lot of conversations, there's a lot of studies about needs, there's less about resources, and partly that's because there might not be very many resources, and I think there's a need to do more kind of on the ground kind of reach into making sure that resources are in the hands of people that need it. I think there's a lot of accountability that needs to come with all these new programs about down payment assistance and home repair dollars to make sure we're actually getting it in the hands of people that need it. And that takes unique strategies, and local governments and kind of advocates and everybody need to figure out how to do that better.
Yeah, and I 100% agree and echo with what Elizabeth and Laura shared. I'll add that there are some additional efforts happening that I would encourage you to get engaged in if this is an intersection you're interested in. So as Laura mentioned, this is a new effort. So I'll speak to Cincinnati specifically first and then blow it out to regional. So last night, Councilwoman Mika Owens hosted, one of the first climate town halls that City Hall has ever hosted in preparation for the next round of the Green Cincinnati Plan. That was at the Bond Hill Recreation Center. And we had residents from all over, representation from all types of organizations to really inform the Climate, Environment, and Infrastructure Committee and the future work of the Green Cincinnati Plan. Speaking of the Green Cincinnati Plan, we are actually about to kick off and launch the next update for the 2023 plan. So the Green Cincinnati Plan is the city's playbook for sustainability action, and it cycles out every 5 years. So the last one we published in 2018. So we got to update it for 2023. And that kickoff will be happening May 31st at the Cincinnati Zoo. And we can make sure to include details on that event in the follow-up email. But we also will be convening a series of subcommittee meetings dedicated to different issues over the course of the summer. So I'll drop a link in the chat so that you can see how to get engaged with those subcommittees if you're interested, as well as there is currently a survey open for folks to fill out with their ideas. And the outcomes of that survey will be communicated throughout this process. And beyond that city-driven process, I'll add that there are partners such as Green Umbrella, Groundwork Ohio River Valley, Interact for Health, and more who are working to ensure that equity is infused not only throughout the plan itself, but through the process of engaging communities to inform this plan. So you'll see a lot more diverse engagement beyond just a subcommittee process. I love that you mentioned flyering and canvassing, because you're exactly right that there are a lot of communities that have not been reached with talking about the intersection between equity, housing, climate, and so much more needs to be done here locally to do that. So yeah, we'll definitely make sure to include details on that. And I recommend signing up for the Green Umbrella newsletters, which I will also drop in the chat because we'll be announcing these opportunities this summer. But I also wanted to blow it out. So this is a regional issue. You know, as I mentioned, climate gentrification not only happens within a jurisdiction, but a lot of folks are getting pushed out of the city or moving into different jurisdictions as housing becomes less affordable. And I see here, you know, we have representation from Norwood on the line, and I recently had spoke with the city, the mayor of the city of Wyoming, who is working to create a flood and housing specific program. I think a next question that I'll sort of throw back to Laura and Elizabeth after I wrap up my diatribe here is that a lot of the policies that we're talking about here and a lot of the activity happening in Cincinnati, we're working with surrounding jurisdictions to ensure that that's happening in their communities as well, because all of these policies are applicable you know, to different forms of government. So when I say different forms of government, either city, township, or county, it takes all to really address the suite of policy needs that we have, as well as to then eventually advocate up to the state, like Elizabeth said. And so that forum, again, where a lot of these conversations will be happening to address it at the regional level, we'll be working on that through the Regional Climate Collaborative, through hopefully a working group dedicated to you know, housing and affordability. We're really making sure to listen to partners and residents on what their needs are to form the priorities for this Regional Climate Collaborative. And so the question I'm going to throw back to Elizabeth and Laura, to the extent that you're aware or have worked in historically, what's your awareness in sort of surrounding jurisdictions on the state of kind of the similar trends and work that you're working on in Cincinnati? Or if there are other organizations outside of Cincinnati you would recommend folks who aren't based in Cincinnati take a look at?
I think so. The roadmap really covers not just the city of Cincinnati, but Hamilton County. Home also works in Butler and Claremont County. So, you know, we have kind of a wide coverage area and seeing lots of different housing needs, from affordable housing issues. Shortage of affordable housing is not unique to the city. And discrimination. I mean, discrimination happens all over the place. So our coverage area kind of extends not just in the city, but to other places as well. In terms of, you know, other, like, I guess, more national kind of partners, we're members of the National Fair Housing Alliance and the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, NCRC. National Fair Housing Alliance is kind of focused on fair housing, and NCRC is more economic justice and kind of access to financial services and kind of economic justice more broadly. But I think it's important that both of these kind of national conversations are including stuff about climate justice, because it is all kind of related. So I think there's opportunities to continue to kind of push that conversation with, you know, kind of with housing focused sectors, because it's not helpful to any of us when we're still so siloed, that we do all need to be kind of working together and promoting the same kind of values and pushing real change forward, because we're all going to lose if we lose kind of a climate fight.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go for it, Laura.
Just one thing to add on to that, because I think that was perfect answer, Elizabeth. But the Keys to Unlock Dreams is a really cool national program by the National Fair Housing Alliance, where they're hoping to do exactly what we've done with the roadmap, is work with 15 cities to develop policy recommendations and really work with them to increasing Black home ownership. So that's a great national program to look into. Yeah.
Great. That's awesome. And I just wanted to make sure folks on the line understood that home works broadly across the region, and that there are ways to take action on these types of policies and these types of efforts. Despite not being, a large urban core like Cincinnati, there are a lot of ways different types of jurisdictions can take action. I did also want to share, so Dana from Norwood shared a story in the chat that Push Buffalo, which is an awesome organization, guess they sued their utility for charging a fee for energy improvements and efficiency, and they had to not spend a dime, and Push got all the money for Buffalo residents with big impact. I'm glad you brought that up, Dana. So Push is an important organization for, they kind of tackle housing and costs at a lot of different angles, including that energy insecurity component, which will definitely be exacerbated as the climate changes. One thing that we saw even just last year, where if you recall that the big cold snap that famously left most of Texas without electricity for an extended period of time, it affected utilities all the way up throughout the middle core of the country, including portions of Ohio. And so this is something that we absolutely need to be aware of. As our summers get hotter right now, Ohio as a state, we experience 5 high heat days per year, but within a matter of 3 decades, so by 2050, within our lifetimes, we will actually experience over 30 high heat days a year. And so this is not only concerning from an energy perspective, where people, not everyone has access to air conditioning, so that's a safety issue, but B, as heat becomes more severe, that is going to drive up utility costs. And a lot of those costs often get pushed off to consumers in different ways as they try to improve their utility infrastructure. So I love that you brought up that example, Dana, of organizations sort of needling at that injustice between sort of energy and housing costs. And you also mentioned in the chat, they wrapped homes and installed new windows, and were able to make some of those home repairs that are also important on top of energy efficiency upgrades. I also wanted to highlight, I saw that Mary from KUFA was on the line. So another great local organization doing work, particularly as it relates to flooding and its impact on homes, and working in neighborhoods to address this. I did want to highlight that something that is happening next week is in partnership between Groundwork Ohio River Valley, Green Umbrella, the city of Cincinnati. We are launching our next climate advisory group, and it'll be focused in the Beekman corridor. And that will include the neighborhoods of South Cumminsville, Millvale, English Woods, and North and South Fairmount. And so this will be an equitable community engagement opportunity to get resident voice directly informing climate planning that's happening through the Green Cincinnati Plan. And this is a mechanism that we've already deployed in Lower Price Hill, Bond Hill, and Roselawn. And we will be working to expand it outside of Cincinnati as well in the coming year. So I see we have another question.
Wait, can I add one more thing about kind of this theme of suing utility companies and making sure that flooding is addressed? So we're a fair housing enforcement agency too, and so that means that we like to enforce the Fair Housing Act, meaning we can file complaints, we can file lawsuits if there is evidence of discrimination on the basis of a protected class like race. There's been some really good examples across the country of how there have been fair housing lawsuits when a jurisdiction or a housing provider fails to equally or fairly address the needs of communities of color around flooding, around water provisions, around kind of disaster relief. And so if there's evidence, if there's any kind of like discrimination happening. And so a couple examples, one just in Northern Ohio, kind of outside of Cleveland, there was a major lawsuit probably a decade ago where the city failed to provide water service to a predominantly Black community, that the water lines literally shut off at the entrance to this historically Black community. There was other examples in the state of Texas and in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, after some major disasters where the federal government and state government failed to provide the same level of disaster relief to communities and families of color. There were differences in how people were accessing those funds. There was a disproportionate effect on limiting kind of the relief provided. So, I think as we're thinking about, well, how is the government responding to this, not just our local government, but state government, federal government, if there's evidence of discrimination on the basis of race or kind of the racial composition of a community, that's something that Home would be very interested in talking more about, kind of to use some of those levers of fair housing enforcement.
Wow, I just learned so much from that additional answer. That's really cool to hear that that is included within the body of enforcement work. Yeah, I was taking notes. So our next question comes from Maya, and the question is, how do we change the perception of climate change being solved with solar panels and being largely a quote unquote rich person's issue? Between an increase of heat/flooding, some have started to see the impact hit them in their neighborhoods. Maya recently spoke with Lisk briefly about potential ways to do that, but curious to hear our thoughts. I am happy to take it first, or y'all can go first if you have thoughts. I know this is sort of my bread and butter, but I'm super curious to hear from your perspective as well.
You go first and we can chime in.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think this is such an important question, Maya. What is really interesting, and I can actually pull up a chart here in a second that I will share, but it is a challenge because so much of the movements of mainstream environmentalism and environmental justice movements have kind of in many ways over the decades like operated in parallel, and there has been some isolation of the EJ movement from a lot of the kind of what's happening on the Hill in Washington, DC, and in other policy efforts across the country. And so I think what's really importantly happening right now is that the environmental justice movement is sort of becoming bigger, like it's always been there, but it's becoming the louder movement, and the criticisms of the mainstream environmental movement are becoming more recognizable and acute. And so I think that, some of the learnings from the environmental justice movement is that the kind of historically technocratic approach to like, how do we solve climate change is we know that that's not the right answer, that these techno fixes can only go so far, and actually so much of what we struggle against is social, economic, and political, and that a lot of what is needed is a culture shift in how we even imagine and sort of lay out what is the problem, but also that then informs what are the appropriate solutions to truly get at the root causes of these issues. And I think that is an important first step. So kind of needling in at what are the white dominant norms that are present in the institutions that are currently working on these issues, both locally and nationally. That will take us away from this sort of technocratic, solely, looking at specific financial or technology solutions, but we really need procedural equity solutions. We need greater diversity of voices informing what are the problems and what are the solutions. And one thing I did want to share just in terms of a chart here is just, what do communities here think locally? So you all can see my slides now, right? So public opinion estimates, you know, this is from the Yale Climate Communications group out in Connecticut. They do this every year. So last year, you can see here that, you know, across Hamilton County, people agree that this is happening. And that the risk perceptions that this is here and this is affecting us. It's already harming people. And, you know, people are beginning to recognize, even here locally, that they are being impacted by climate change. I've also pulled here just an example from Warren County. You know, it's not only like, do we need to fund the research for the technology? Not only do we need the economic incentives to get there, but we also need to be teaching about these issues. Like it's not just a policy now, it's an awareness across generations. And we have some gaps in terms of sort of behavior, as you were saying earlier, like the awareness of these issues is relatively low. And so I just wanted to share those graphs to kind of highlight that, you know, I guess like the intention is there, but we need to be very intentional about creating mechanisms that aren't isolating and aren't super technocratic and aren't like bludgeoning communities with languages and jargon in such a way to make it inaccessible. Like we have to make not only the process of creating this accessible, but the way we talk about it as well. And I'll stop there because I could go on forever. I'd love to hear if Elizabeth or Laura have anything they'd want to add before we need to wrap up.
I will add, I think you covered most of it, Savannah, but I think another really key component that was touched upon today too was the importance of removing barriers to participate. So as we're having, you know, these sessions, these engagement opportunities, making sure that, you know, there is childcare provided, that we are taking the conversations to the people to really be able to get feedback. That's why I loved that, you know, yesterday's town hall was in the community, because it should be easy to access, and we should be really working on removing those barriers to access. The other thing that goes with that is participation. I think it was the Green Cincinnati plan had a ton of engagement, a ton of surveys, but I think it was less than 1% of the people who had submitted surveys identified as Black. You know, in a city that is as diverse as we are, we need to make sure that those numbers match a little bit more so we can engage with everybody and really make sure that we're seeing the whole picture here.
I think the only thing I'll add to this, you know, your comment is like between the increase of heat and flooding, like the low income and communities of color have started to see these impacts the most. And I think that's like the nail on the head, is like they're not just seeing these impacts, they're already feeling these impacts. And I think the other thing, you know, low income folks and our kind of affordable housing, they're already at risk, a greater risk for mold, for really terrible substandard housing conditions that threaten their health. For lead, we have a huge lead paint problem in the city that are disproportionately affecting people of color. That's all kind of these environmental issues that are only going to get worse as we see kind of those climate change. It's not just kind of heat and flooding, it's these environmental issues that have already been around that we still haven't solved for like 50, 60 years. And so I think that's where really focusing on solutions about how do we address those needs and the upcoming needs, the very real pressing needs of heat, of flooding, we need to focus first on how we're equipping neighborhoods of color, kind of low income families, to really protect themselves first before we kind of talk about, or I guess, you know, not before, but really kind of using that as a priority in addition to kind of the larger policy issues that we need to be talking about too.
Excellent. I can't imagine a better note to end on. So thank you so much for everyone for joining us, and special thanks to Elizabeth and Laura for sharing their home wisdom and action items. You all receive a follow-up with this recording and some additional resources, and keep an eye out for the next sign up for the next webinar and future events related to these topics. So thanks everyone. Have a good day.